All right, everybody. So now we're going to talk about Africa and Arab lands uh, during and shortly after World War One. So in the 1900s, almost all of the entire continent of Africa was colonized by Europe. And the Europeans were not so nice to the Africans. Africans were kicked out of the best land and Europeans took it. Africans were only allowed to work low-level jobs. Like all the bosses in every job was a white European that looked like me. And they were on their farms, they were forced to grow cash crops and not food for themselves. So they had to grow crops, sell them for money, and then use that money to buy food to feed their families. They couldn't just grow food to feed their families. Plus, in World War I, over 1 million Africans were sent to fight in World War I. Many Africans that had been educated in Europe went back to Africa and resented the Europeans for colonizing them. We've talked about this a bunch, that the Europeans encouraged Africans to send their children to school in Europe because they thought it would make the children like Europe. And instead, what it did was these Africans who had been taught through all of their schooling that people should be free and people should be able to rule themselves, they go back and they believe that. They go back home to Africa and they don't get to rule themselves. They don't get to be free. They were really upset about this. So there were anti-imperialist movements all over the African continent. Protests, all kinds of things. So I want to specifically talk about South Africa. And when I say South Africa, I'm not talking about the region, I'm talking about the country. This country, South Africa. Sometimes when you're talking about South Africa, you don't really know, well, is the person talking about this whole region of Southern Africa? Or are you talking about the country, South Africa? And that's usually how it is. If someone's talking about the region, they say Southern Africa. And if they're talking about the country, they say South Africa. So now we're going to talk about South Africa for a minute. In South Africa, in the 30s, 1930s, and 40s, the white Europeans took strong control over the Black Africans. And they made it really difficult for Blacks to survive at all. Plus, if you had black skin, you had to have an ID, an identification card on you at all times. And any white person could just stop you to say, let me see your pass. And they made it to where Black people could only live in certain neighborhoods, and white people lived in really nice, fancy neighborhoods, and Black people had to live in really poor neighborhoods. And then in 1948, apartheid began, and apartheid legalized that. Legally, Black people could only live in Black neighborhoods, and white people could only live in white neighborhoods. And the white neighborhoods were really nice and fancy with good schools, and the Black neighborhoods, not so much. Resistance grew out of this. And a thing called the African National Congress began. This is in South Africa. The African National Congress began, and the African National Congress had absolutely no power whatsoever at all over anything. It was just a bunch of Africans that got together and talked about how they thought things should change. And at this time, they had absolutely no power whatsoever. I'm only talking to you about it because in the future, the African National Congress rises up and actually does have power. But at this time, it was just a bunch of poor Black people getting together and talking, and they had no power whatsoever over anything. And now we're finished with South Africa, and I'm going back to Africa as a whole. In the 20s, well, in the late, 1917 through the 1920s, this major movement called PanAfricanism began. Hopefully you remember what pan means. We talked about pan-Slavic. Pan-African includes everyone whose ancestors originally came from Africa. So that means, let's see, here's Africa, but there are descendants of African slaves all around Europe, descendants of African slaves all through the Americas, on these little islands in here. Pan-Africanism covers all people with very, very dark skin whose ancestors originally came from Africa. It's a movement that includes all of them. And a famous leader of the Pan-Africanism movement, his name was Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey's big thing was Africa for Africans. His big saying, his big political cry, his big thing that he said, he wanted Africa for Africans. He wanted white people gone. And he wanted Africa run by Africans. In 1919, a famous Pan-African thinker that lived in the US, W.E.B. Du Bois, he's a descendant of slaves. W.E.B. Du Bois, he made the Pan-African Congress met in Paris. Tell me, what else was happening in Paris in 1919? Yes, the Allies' Paris Peace Treaty was going on in Paris in 1919. Well, W.E.B. Du Bois, with his group from the Pan-African Congress, they went to the Allies to try to get the Allies to give their colonies in Europe freedom. Give them respect, give them their freedom. But they didn't pay any attention to them at all. The Allies ignored them. The only thing that happened from this Pan-African movement at the time was Egypt was given its freedom. Egypt had been a colony of Great Britain, and Great Britain officially said Egypt was free, but Egypt was a monarchy. It became a monarchy so they could, because they were free now, And Great Britain still had like total control over that monarchy. The king asked Great Britain before he did anything. So while they were officially on paper, they were free, they were still completely controlled by Great Britain. All right. Post World War I, post means after, oh, too many T's there. Post World War I, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire was near collapse. They were falling apart everywhere. And the Sultan, that's the, like the emperor, the Sultan, like in Europe, it's an emperor. And in Russia, this is Western Europe. In Western Europe, it's an emperor. In Russia, it's a czar. Well, in the Ottoman Empire, it was a sultan. These all mean the same thing. And he very reluctantly signed the Treaty of Sèvres. This is a French word. This is Sèvres, the Treaty of Sèvres. In the Treaty of Sèvres, the Ottoman Empire lost all Arab lands, lost all of North African lands, and lost a lot of land of what we now call Turkey. Let's see. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire came all through here. It controlled all this and all this and all of this and a whole bunch up here. And they lost all this, they lost all this. And here's where Turkey is today. They lost a bunch of this land, was given to Greece. So all this green land was lost and given to Greece. Well, when Greeks came over here to settle their land and say, hey, this is ours now, this is ours. Turkish nationalists, people from Turkey, rose up, fought against the oppressive empire of the Ottoman Empire. They fought against the Ottoman Empire, and they fought against the Greek, and they won both. The Greeks fled, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and this guy, the leader of that, his name was Mustafa. Actually, I'm going to start a new page. Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal was the one that led the Turkish nationalists to fight against the Ottoman Empire and fight against Greece, and he won. And when he won, so he overthrew the Sultan, but now he's named himself the leader of Turkey. And when he does that, he changes his name to Ataturk. Ataturk means father of the Turks. And he made all kinds of changes in Turkey. He wanted to westernize and modernize, which really is what westernize means at this time, was to become modern. He did things like he forced the people of Turkey to wear Western clothes. They weren't allowed to wear their traditional Turkish clothes anymore. He made them wear Western clothes. He made roads and railroads and opened factories. He closed down the religious schools and opened up secular schools. Secular is like this school that you're attending. I don't teach you religion, and I don't sit here. I'm not teaching you the Holy Bible all day, every day. This is a secular school. That means secular is non-religious. So all the schools before in Turkey had been religious schools. And now he's closed the religious schools, opened secular schools. He's built factories, he's done roads, he's done railroads. He's making the people wear Western clothes. And he's also hired Western people to come over and help guide him in how can I make my country more Western. And overall, lots of people really, really liked him for this, but lots of very conservative Islamic people did not like him for this. They thought everything should stay the same. So then Persia looked over at Turkey. Let's look at the map again. Persia, here's Persia, looks over at Turkey and goes, hey, that looks pretty cool. And in 1925, do you guys remember that Russia was kind of encroaching in on Persia from here, and Great Britain was encroaching here, and so Persia was kind of losing their own identity because Russia and Great Britain were taking over so much power, and Persia was upset with that. So this army officer in 1925 named Reza Khan, he overthrew the Shah, which is another word. So Western Europe is emperor, Russia is czar. Where am I? Sorry, I'm losing track. Right. The Ottoman Empire, it was Sultan. And in Persia, it's Shah. These all are the same kind of thing. Emperor, Tsar, Sultan, Shah. It's just different names used in different countries. So in Persia, in 1925, there was unrest. People were looking over at Turkey and wanting to change. Reza Khan overthrew the Shah and made himself the new Shah. And he did the same thing that Ataturk did in Turkey. And he pushed forward massive reforms, massive change. The people have to wear Western clothes. No more religious schools, secular schools, roads, railroads, factories, all kinds of modernization. He made the laws secular because the law in Persia had been Muslim law based on the Quran. And now he's got secular laws. And Reza Khan encouraged women to get out of the house, go get jobs, participate in society. And again, the strong conservative Muslim society did not like this. The more progressive people, totally cool with it. They loved it. But the people that were very, very Muslim, very religious, very conservative, did not like these changes at all. They fiercely condemned this. Then there was a pan-Arab movement growing all on the Arabian Peninsula. This is, see, it's a peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, And all across North Africa, because they're all kind of Arab peoples, North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, a pan-Arab movement was happening. So the Arabs had felt completely betrayed by the Allies. Let's go back to that map. Do you remember when these Arabs helped fight the Ottoman Empire for the Allies? And so they thought they were going to get independence and freedom when World War II was over. They thought at the peace treaty that, of course, the Arab lands would get their freedom. Woo! It didn't happen that way. All the Allies did was break up who's in control of what part of this peninsula. And wow, they were not happy with that. And all through the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a massive anti-imperialist movement all across the Arab Peninsula, and they still happen today. Still today, there's huge anti-Western feelings and anti-imperialism. You can, if I had time, I'd look up a protest on the internet, but you can do that. Go look on YouTube for anti-Western protests on the Arabian Peninsula. They happen all the time. Now, there's only a little bit left. Ever since, well, first I want to show you where I'm talking about now. Now I'm going to talk to you about this land here, and specifically along the coast here. Should be, okay. All along in here is where we're talking about. I've lost my, here we go. Okay, since the Roman times, that's a long time ago, the Romans, ever since then, the Jews have wanted a homeland. The Jews lost their homeland of Judea, and it was called Palestine because the Romans renamed it to Palestine because Palestine was ancient Jewish enemy. And since then, Muslims had taken over control of the land, but the Jews want their land back. It's what they think of as their promised land. The Jews believe this land was promised to them by God. Abraham, who's a famous character from the Bible, had a covenant with God. A covenant is a promise with God, and this land belongs to them. But over centuries and centuries and centuries, they had been pushed out, and their land, their promised land, had been taken over by Muslims. Well, in 1897, this movement called the Zionist movement began by a man named Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl started a Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement was a big political movement for the Jews to return to the promised land. But at the time, that promised land was Palestine, and it was Muslim. But there was this huge movement for Jews to take over and get their land back. In World War I, the Allies did some tricky stuff, and the Allies promised the Arabs that Palestine would be theirs forever. But the Allies also promised the Jews they would get their promised land back. But if you see, we are talking about the exact same piece of land. The Allies were just telling anybody anything they wanted to hear to get support. They told the Arabs, oh yeah, help us fight and Palestine will be yours forever. They told the Jews, help us fight, we'll give you your promised land back. From 1919 to 1940, tens of thousands of Jews moved into Palestine, trying to start, they were the Zionist movement, trying to regain their Holy Land. And the Arabs were not happy about this because it's their land. And there were constantly battles, like the Arabs would attack Jewish settlements, and then the Jewish settlements would attack the Palestinian settlements. And this is still going on today. Still today, now you have the Arabs and the Jews fighting in this Palestine-Israeli state of, the Arabs say this is ours, it's been ours for 800 years. And the Jews say, no, it's ours because God gave it to us.